to thank everybody for joining this virtual briefing entitled Remote Learning at the Time of COVID-19 Pandemic, held by the Committee on Education and Labor. And I hope you and your loved ones are staying safe and healthy during this extraordinary time. I want to remind everything of a few things before we get started. First, this is a public-facing event. A recording of the audio and video of the briefing will be made available to the press and public shortly after it concludes. Second, I want to note that we developed the briefing in conjunction with the minority, but we learned from the ranking member that she did not intend to participate. However, the briefing is still open to all committee members, and we continue to invite all of our colleagues to participate today. Understand that many may decline. This is not an official committee activity, as there is no official record of this event. Any member who wishes to share a statement or an article or letter may do so using their office communication methods. If anyone is experiencing any trouble during the briefing, please contact the committee's IT director, Sheila Havener, or the chief committee clerk, Talise Ali, by email or phone. Their emails and addresses were sent out with the notice for the briefing. With that, I'd like to ask the clerk to conduct a roll call of members. Please unmute yourself when you respond to the roll call. Madam Clerk.
Chairman Scott.
Present.
Mrs. Davis.
Present.
Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Courtney. Ms. Fudge. Mr. Sablon.
Good morning. Hello. Here.
Ms. Wilson. Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Takano. Ms. Adams.
Here.
Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. Norco. Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Morelli. Ms. Weil. Mr. Harder. Mrs. McBath. Ms. Schreier. Ms. Underwood. Mrs. Hayes. Ms. Shalala.
599-1523.
Mr. Levin.
Here.
Ms. Omar. Mr. Trone. Ms. Stevens. Mrs. Lee. Mrs. Trahan.
Here.
Mr.
Here. I'm here.
Okay. Mr. Castro. Mrs. Fox. Mr. Rowe. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Grothman. Ms. Stefanik. Mr. Allen. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Banks. Mr. Walker. Mr. Comer. Mr. Klein. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Wright. Mr. Muser. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Keller, Mr. Murphy, Mr. Van Drew. Chairman Scott, this concludes the roll call.
Thank you. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is upending our education system. Today, the school systems across the country are grappling with how to ensure access to education for nearly 50 million children whose schooling has been disrupted by COVID-19. They're also struggling with deeply inadequate support for remote learning due to educational inequities in school funding, resources, and equipment, and teacher preparation. Our most underserved students who already face systemic barriers to quality education before the virus are in danger of falling further behind their peers and suffering long-term mental health consequences. News reports indicate that half of children in certain high poverty schools cannot access distance learning. For example, in Cleveland Metropolitan School District, 30 to 40% of students do not have internet access. DC Public Schools also estimates that about 30% of its 52,000 students lack access to internet connections. State constitutions guarantee students the right to adequate education. As Congress, I think we've got a little disturbance here. Okay, I think we got it. As state constitutions guarantee students the right to adequate education, and so Congress crafts the next coronavirus relief package, we must ensure that all school communities, particularly those most in need, have the support to deliver quality education. Today, we're joined by Mr. Marlon Stiles and Ms. Robin Lake to discuss the importance of federal funding to help schools mitigate learning loss and deliver remote learning to all students during this pandemic. Mr. Stiles has more than 15 years of experience in the curriculum development and instructional technology and has served as superintendent of Middletown City School District in Ohio since 2017. Ms. Robin Lake is the director of the Center on Reinventing Public Education, a nonpartisan K-12 research and policy organization. Her research focuses on, among other things, innovation and reforms in K-12 education. Each presenter will have approximately 8 minutes to speak, and once your time is up, a chime will go off to let you know that your time has expired. At that time, I'll ask you to please wrap up. After our experts finish their questions, I'll recognize members in order of seniority, whether or not they were here for the roll call in case members joined us late. When members are recognized, they'll have the opportunity to ask presenters questions. Recognizing that we only have 1 hour, I'd ask that members adhere to the time and question limitation. The sooner we can get your question asked, the more time we'll have for other members to get questions in. The chime will go off after 3 minutes have passed, and at that time, we ask you to please wrap up. Once we get through the list of members, I'll call on members who did not respond the first time they were recognized in order of seniority in case they joined the meeting late. But if a member gets disconnected while they're speaking, they can come back in as soon as they get back on. So thank everyone for participating. I want to turn over first to Mr. Stiles and then to Mrs. Lake to share a few words. And afterwards, we'll have questions from the members, starting with Mr. Stiles.
Good afternoon, Chairman Scott, members of the Education and Labor Committee. My name is Marlon Stiles. I am the proud superintendent of Middletown City School District. I'm a passionate leader who believes in every student, and I'm one of nearly 4,000 superintendents who pledge to use technology to personalize education for students through the Future Ready Schools initiative, the Alliance for Excellence Education. Middletown's an urban school district located in Southwest Ohio, and we have transformed our district. We're now seeing positive improvements in student growth, early literacy, and graduation rates. We have a 100% free and reduced lunch rate, 24.7% poverty rate, and our median household income is just over $39,000. I have 5 key areas to focus in my comments for the committee today: our obligation to educate, basic needs, closing the equity gap for marginalized populations, funding, and recommendations. It is an honor and a privilege to serve my community and our students. It is also a constitutional obligation for our states to provide students with a public education. In the midst of this crisis, we are called to redouble our efforts to fulfill the obligation. This crisis has demonstrated the critical role of public schools in not only educating students, but also in meeting their basic needs. Many parents are expressing their number one priority is survival. In my district, remote learning is not the priority, as many families are trying to figure out how to keep food on the table, stay healthy, maintain or find employment while assuming the primary role of educator for their children. Imagine being a grandparent responsible for raising multiple kids right now. You don't have laptops in the home. You have no clue how to teach proportions or help the 12th grade student in your house meet the graduation requirements. Would remote learning be at the top of the priority list? My question is, how can we help support the parents so they are prepared to serve as teachers? We are doing our best to serve as the life source and the community hub for those in survival mode here in Middletown. Meeting the basic needs of our students comes first. We're distributing an average of 40,000 plus meals per week to students. Staff members were making home visits to drop off assignments and sometimes assist with laundering clothes for kids. We need continued federal support to ensure students and their families are safe, housed, fed, and these are the prerequisites for any type of learning. Now that schools are shut down and engaging in remote learning, the equity gap is taking center stage in this country. The nation's students do not have a choice in their learning experience when it comes to remote learning. It is already predetermined if these students will be logged in or logged out. Students either have a device and reliable internet in their home or they do not. Students are either logged in or they are logged out. Logged in students are at home engaging in learning on a laptop. They have daily virtual access to their teachers for guidance, instruction, and support. Logged in students are using a variety of educational digital platforms to support their learning. Logged in students are able to virtually participate in meetings with their peers. Logged out students are at home without a device and without reliable internet service. They pick up packets of worksheets to complete at home. Oftentimes, logged out students do not have the supplies to complete assignments found in the packets. These students wait for letters in the mail or phone calls from their teachers each and every day. The logged out student is not receiving a high quality education right now. These students are accustomed to the barriers to gaining an education, but the remote learning happening right now creates even more barriers that they must overcome. Our community survey data in regards to logged out students indicates a high degree of frustration and concern for a lack of learning. Marginalized students too often are logged out. This is the homework gap, and we must connect all kids now. Prior to school shutdown, we estimate at least 20% of our students do not have internet access at home. One parent shared with me she is choosing to spend her last few dollars on food instead of paying for her internet bill. A parent of a visually impaired student shared she needs a Braille reader at home for her daughter to be able to do school activities. I lose sleep at night knowing logged in students have access to high quality remote learning opportunities, while logged out students are at home wishing they could be in class with their teachers. This equity gap is causing substantial learning loss. It is estimated students may have maintained only 70% of their progress in reading from this school year and less than half of their progress in math. Worse, these figures don't account for the trauma students experience as a result of COVID-19. Marginalized students will have experienced a significant loss of instructional time due to the closure. In Middletown, we celebrate over 90% of our third grade students reading on grade level. I'm concerned next year the percentage will decrease due to the large amount of lost instructional time. The challenge of meeting students' basic needs combined with lost instructional time resulting from the closures makes it critical for us to provide high quality remote learning, including virtual instruction and extended learning time beyond the traditional calendar in order to mitigate learning losses. Making matters worse, even more challenging, we're now facing severe budget cuts. In April, we approved $2 million in reductions. Federal financial support is key to educating our students throughout this crisis. Funding provided by the CARES Act will be helpful, but is insufficient. Our governor recently announced a $300 million cut to K-12 education for this fiscal year, and we fear this is just the beginning. Financial recovery from this crisis will take time, potentially requiring reductions that will negatively impact students, millions across the country. The devastating financial impact will widen the existing equity and achievement gaps without question. Education is primarily a state and local responsibility, but the federal government has historically played a critical role in promoting equity. It is a privilege to educate our nation's students, but we need federal support to do so. I would like to offer several recommendations. Congress must prioritize state fiscal stabilization. Education comprises a major portion of state budgets, and state budgets are being decimated. I certainly appreciate the resources we received from the CARES Act, though we need to put the CARES Act into perspective. This important legislation provided more than $2 trillion, but only $31 billion for education. By comparison, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided $800 billion, including $100 billion for education. The CARES Act was followed by additional legislation providing $500 billion for small businesses and hospitals, but nothing for schools. We need to support our students. Therefore, I join organizations nationwide in asking Congress to provide at least $175 billion in state fiscal stabilization funds. Additional resources will be necessary for us to extend learning time so we can mitigate learning losses and address equity gaps. Funding will need to provide an elevated level of support to marginalized students in education in the summer and extended learning time when schools reopen, and likely for the next few years. In addition, Congress needs to provide at least $4 billion through E-rate program to increase home internet access. It is simply unfair for students to be logged out and others to be logged in. Special populations of students need additional support. I ask Congress to provide $500 million in targeted funding for homeless students. Our students are going to return with both enthusiasm and challenges. For many students from underserved communities, they will be returning having experienced hunger, neglect, and possibly abuse. Schools will need resources to help measure the degree of learning loss that has taken place, as well as resources to meet the needs of the whole child so we can ensure their success. Our challenge: how can we eliminate the homework gap? How can we find a way to put supports in place to support the social emotional needs of students when they return to school? How can we make equity a priority in education for this country? Can we make it a priority to center our attention on historically under-resourced children? We have an opportunity to connect all kids now. In my heart, I believe we can do it. Chairman Scott and members of the Education and Labor Committee, I thank you for the opportunity to stand up for all students today, and I thank you for believing in our youth.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much. And Dr. Lake?
Good afternoon, Chairman Scott, members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the nationwide shutdown of public schools in a response to the pandemic and the move to distance learning. My name is Robin Lake, and I lead a nonpartisan research center at the University of Washington called the Center on Reinventing Public Education. And since mid-March, our team of researchers has been tracking every week how school districts and states are responding to the crisis. This was a shock to our education system. In uncharted territory, district leaders had to make very difficult decisions at a very anxious time for all Americans. No one was prepared, no one knew the right path forward, so our goal was to help districts quickly learn from each other and keep as many students as possible learning. So what have we learned over these last 6 weeks? Well, in the early days, most districts really did struggle to move to distance learning. Many were consumed with basic needs like delivering food and services, critical supports for families. This was especially true in the larger urban districts serving the most economically disadvantaged students. Special education was a particular worry. Most districts initially did little more than to provide a list of available online resources for families. Parents found themselves scrambling to create their own learning programs and daily schedules, all of this while they were dealing with the chaos of the crisis. Slowly, this has been changing. Over the past several weeks, districts really have moved from being in shock to being in the cloud, and most districts are now offering some kind of learning program. The experience for students and families, however, is really highly varied depending on where they live and what kind of resources they have access to. In some districts, students are receiving packets of worksheets or watching learning programs on TV broadcasts. In others, teachers might be recording videos and asking students to work independently and submit online work. Most of the time, parents are bearing the responsibility for making sure the work is getting done. Increasingly, districts are realizing that, challenging as it might be, they need to find ways to provide speech therapy and other specialized services from afar. One superintendent in Colorado told us that while he certainly wasn't happy about the crisis, it was, in his words, a swift kick in the pants to start innovating. Miami-Dade County Schools was one of the first large school districts to move online and has distributed over 100,000 internet-enabled devices to its students. They have a 92% daily online attendance rate. The district is providing strong professional development and supports for teachers and families, all while holding to high standards for teaching and learning. The New York City Department of Education is providing special education instruction online. Students with all kinds of disabilities can access specialized instruction along with their peers. Some public charter schools have used their flexibility to teach in innovative ways. Instead of one teacher working with a group of 30 students, one is delivering live lectures to a larger group, while others provide individualized support for students and families. Despite all of this, it's clear that too many districts are still not providing meaningful instruction and don't have the capacity to. Just half of those we track are providing instruction and monitoring student progress, and even fewer, only 27%, are tracking attendance. We can't know if students are okay and how we can support them at home if we aren't asking them to log on daily and checking in with them. And certainly, too many students still lack access to reliable devices and hotspots that's preventing any of that from happening. Meanwhile, private schools, high-flying suburban schools have been pretty quick to move online and expect students to finish the year's coursework. Affluent school districts are twice as likely to expect all teachers to teach. In these schools, teachers are conducting compelling real-time classes using video conference technology and their own creativity. There are guest lectures by global coronavirus experts, Socratic discussions, and even student-run music clubs. It's exciting to see. What all this means, however, is that there will be significant learning loss in many parts of the country and for many, many kids. Researchers from NWEA are calling this the COVID slide and saying that elementary students may have lost half the math skills they should have learned this year. And students who are already behind will almost surely fall further behind. When schools do reopen, students are going to face learning gaps that might not be closed for years. It's critical that we finally address these inequities. But there's a perfect storm brewing. Next year, intensive learning and mental health needs will collide with projected budget cuts and layoffs, creating an unprecedented challenge for our public schools. Most students won't have the content or knowledge they need for grade level courses. They'll have, many of them, deep and lasting trauma. Students with disabilities will have missed months of therapeutic services, and a number of students will be missing or homeless. On top of the health guidelines and the limitations on the number of students in classrooms, buses, extraordinary additional expenses, schools will have to continue teaching online for some students for part of the day and may close again due to regional infections. The economic slowdown ahead is going to mean bare bones student school budgets and teacher layoffs. We're hearing that the overall estimates of cuts to state budgets could range from 10 to 30% cuts, an average perhaps of $800 to $2,400 per student. And in contrast, the stimulus funds that have been provided so far are estimated by Georgetown University to amount to about $270 per pupil, not nearly enough to fill the gap. And these are financial impacts that will continue for years and will hit the highest poverty schools the hardest. Schools with large concentrations of low-income students typically have more new teachers and will bear the brunt of seniority-based layoffs unless policymakers act. So unless we get serious about flattening the learning loss curve, our educators are going to be overwhelmed and too many students could go into academic death spirals. There isn't a need for more money, and there is no way to buy our way fully out of this problem. More federal funding will almost certainly be needed, and it will be imperative that every dollar is spent on evidence-based solutions. We can flatten the learning loss curve despite the unprecedented challenge if we have a nationwide mobilization to work together to first limit learning loss now and over the summer with intensive tutoring around core skills, Second, to assess and prioritize the greatest needs, including students with special needs and those who struggled in the online environment. Third, using evidence and adapting the way schools teach and support kids next year. Policies and practices will have to shift rapidly on behalf of kids. New federal money will be needed for providing devices and broadband connections, and federal education dollars can support research-based interventions like the following. Tutors to ensure every student develops the skills and knowledge they need to progress to the next grade, using programs like AmeriCorps, perhaps. Quality summer learning for students and professional development time for teachers, perhaps looking to Title I and special education funding. New pathways to college and career through innovative high school partnerships with community colleges, industry, and trade unions. Compensatory special education services. Meaningful assessments and data systems. We can't ask teachers and parents to fly blind next year. These are all evidence-based ideas, but they will require educators, communities, and families to look beyond traditional turf wars and act with urgency and creativity. Some will require difficult shifts away from how things have always been. It's clear this crisis didn't create inequality. It shined a light on deeply troubling realities that are hardwired into public education. There are obvious steps we can take, like closing connectivity gaps, but we can't stop there. We need to ask, what is this crisis telling us about our public education system? How will we react? Are we willing to put the full force of resources and quality instruction behind the communities and students most in need? Thank you. With strong leadership from you, I do believe public education can emerge from this crisis with a new urgency and vision of what's possible for all students. Thanks again for allowing me to share our research, and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll have questions from members. Thank you for your input. This is very helpful. And I'm going to defer my questions till the end. And so I'll start with, let's see who's next. Ms. Davis.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to jump in. And I really wanted to thank both of you because you present this with such urgency. And it was really troubling me that at the beginning of our conversations, we didn't have the opportunity to quite focus on education the way we should, and to recognize the desperation that children are in. And we'll be in even further if we can address it. So if I could just turn for a second, Ms. Lake, I think on your first, about limiting learning loss now and this national mobilization, and we struggle sometimes, what our role here is in Congress, because people are very focused on local and state, as you well know. And so I just wanted to go ahead and put my video on so you can see me too. Could you talk about this issue of deploying to bolster tutoring? We're in a different element now because of social distancing, so things are going to be different. Ordinarily, you could bring people together you wanted to vet people, you have to be sure you have, students paired properly with older children, things like that. But how do we, give us some thoughts about deploying, because it seems to me that there are certain milestones that students have to reach, and that we need to focus on those particularly. I mean, I'd love to focus on everything, but we're not going to be able to do that. And so perhaps if you could start, and then Mr. Superintendent Stiles, what is it? I mean, if we had to actually say, we will guarantee that every child in this age group has this ability. We talk about reading by 3rd grade. What is it that we have to be absolutely certain that no child goes into next year without this?
Thank you. I'll just take a brief swipe at it, and I'll turn it to Mr. Stiles for his expert educator opinion. My belief is that we're going to have to get very crystal clear on just what you say, exactly what are the critical foundational skills that students will need to be able to enter their next grade level's work next fall. And then we're going to have to be able to adapt to whatever realities are put in front of us. Districts are getting very strategic about how to think through different scenario plannings and things. But what we know from research is that the best way to accelerate students,
Okay, thank you.
and not put them in remedial classes, but accelerate them to the level that all students should be at, we need to focus on, as much as possible, one-on-one tutoring and double dosing in the kind of content areas that they need. There is where I think an army of tutors could be deployed through AmeriCorps or some other means. There are a lot of unemployed folks out right now who could be put to work. Let's do it. Now we will have the distancing requirements, and so that's where we're going to have to get creative. But we're seeing every day, even here, what we can do with virtual environments, and I am sure we can figure out a way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Grijalva, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Bobby, for hosting this, and to both witnesses for really powerful evidence. Again, we're obviously on the cusp of hopefully doing another COVID CARES 2.0 bill, and so the timing of this, in terms of just the urgency that Susan just described, I mean, is really important. And Mr. Stiles, one part of the federal government's support for K through 12 is special education. Certainly in Connecticut, where I'm from, which Governor Lamont finally threw in the towel yesterday and closed the schools for the rest of the year. We're definitely hearing from parents, school superintendents, and others that this population is really, again, at everything times 2 or 3, in terms of just the magnitude of the problem. I just wonder if you could sort of address that, and also just the rate of expenditure of funds in terms of trying to keep up with that population's needs, and certainly as we sort of put together a COVID supplemental bill, whether or not that's one we should be keeping our eye on.
Thank you for the question. And just to share a little bit out from the special ed perspective, it is very difficult when you're not sitting in front of someone to provide them with occupational therapy. It's difficult to provide them with physical therapy. It's difficult to work with them and provide them speech therapy. Our staff has done a phenomenal job staying compliant with IEPs and the goals, but that's compliance. I think your question is around service, and that's the part that's most difficult right now, not having access to the children. We're able to sometimes get creative for those that actually have reliable internet service and a device in the home to provide some type of service. But for those that don't or need intense services, it is virtually impossible to do that without being there in person. So when you talk about it being twofold and amplified significantly, you're absolutely right. Our fear is that students' goals are not being met because we're not able to provide services because of the safety restrictions and the guidelines that are in place around social distancing. I will say from a district standpoint, our expenditures are significantly increasing when it comes to providing services for students with disabilities. We are seeing an increase in students with disabilities qualifying for services, and that's really impacting our budget. And we're talking almost a 30% increase in our expenditures in the last 5 years for special ed services and staffing. Staffing is really the biggest cost. As you talk about those with the most intense needs, they require individual support, classroom aides, self-contained classrooms. And then the other side of it also that we're finding during the shutdown as well is that while these students are home and they need certain types of equipment, or even during the school year sometime, parents simply in a high poverty area cannot afford the equipment that their kids need to continue that education when they get home. I shared the story of the parent whose daughter needed a Braille reader at home. She could not afford it. And not to make a joke of it, but our student services director actually broke into the school one day and she set the alarm off, forgot her code. But she was going to school to get the Braille reader, the school's purchased Braille reader, and give that to the parent at home so that during the shutdown, she was able to engage in some of her activities. Oftentimes when that equipment goes home, we don't see that equipment back. So those are additional expenditures we have to put in place in our budget to recover some of those items. But it's definitely a concern of ours, not the compliant piece, but the need that we're going to have that we predict in the future is compensatory services to make sure that we're able to help these students meet their goals that are inside their IEPs.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Fudge, Mr. Sablon, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much. This is thank you for putting this meeting together, Mr. Chairman. Look, for this remaining school year, I think there's very little we could do for my district, but and I don't know exactly how many of my students don't have access to internet. I know that many of them don't have access to computers, but at the same time, I would like very much if we could prepare for the next school year when it starts in August or September, and funding for somehow to get online learning is very, very important. I know that, again, like I said, 60% of the students in my district fall below the poverty line. And that will tell you how much we need to get the help that we could get so we could have online learning. Not just, and I guess I will speak for my district, but I will also speak to the outlying areas, the American Samoa, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. They need help as well. I am sure. But any suggestions on from our two guests on what we could do would be very, very much appreciated. And Mr. Chairman, just before I forget, I thank you very much to you and of course our committee staff for all the help in getting our ESF funding notices released. My Assistant Secretary Brogan yesterday assured me that the funds will come out next week, and I will hold him to that. He said I should be reassured that it will come out next week because over 700 of our teachers have been furloughed. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
I'll share a few things in response to that question. Kind of what we're experiencing here locally and in our region, and I've talked to a few superintendents across the country. We think one of the top priorities right now to set us up for success, to be able to meet the needs of our students, is students having access to a reliable device to engage in academic activities. So just share a little bit from a teaching and learning perspective. That would be some type of tablet, iPad, or a laptop. We do not consider a telephone to be an academic device that would be reliable. In addition to the internet as well, having access there. I mean, a lot of people have been talking about hotspots, but just to talk about that good old-fashioned supply and demand. Demand is skyrocketing right now and supply is super low. Turnaround for any type of purchase order for hotspots right now in Middletown area, this part of Southwest Ohio, is a little over 3 weeks. I know some of the internet providers have come out and offered free broadband access to families for 60 days during the shutdown piece. But for some families who are in high poverty, that's difficult because what we're finding, some of the providers are saying if you have an outstanding bill that you can't have access to those 60 free days until you pay your bill. And they're asking for specific documents, creating a barrier to get access to that free internet access. So I think our vision is to have reliable residential Wi-Fi access inside the homes of students. We're trying to shy away from a request or to explore a plan where kids go to a certain portion of the community, they have to transport themselves there or walk there, connect to some internet server, and then walk away and wait till they have connectivity again. We talk about connecting all kids now. We want every kid in their home to have access to reliable, high-quality internet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there are any, when we call the roll, no Republicans responded. If there's any minority member on the call just speak up and you'll be recognized. If not, we'll continue. Ms. Wilson, Ms. Bonamici, Mr. Chicano, Dr. Adams.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Is there someone talking? Is that Mr. Chicano? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, you'll be next. Let's let Alma go ahead.
I'm fine.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our guests today for your information and for sharing with us. My home state of North Carolina recently released a plan that will pass students to the next grade unless there was a plan to retain them before schools were closed on March 13th. Our schools are facing tough situations, as you've mentioned, but I'm afraid, as you've probably already said, that our students may come back in September unprepared for the next grade. Ms. Lake, your data shows that an increasing number of school districts have prepared distance learning strategies. Of course, for distance learning to be effective, students must have access to the internet at home. 20% of African American and Latino students don't have that internet access, according to the Department of Ed proposals like HR 6563, which would provide $2 billion to fund the purchase of hotspots and modems and routers by libraries and schools are a good start. But what conditions on the ground can Congress help create to ensure distance learning strategies can tackle the issue of the homework debt?
Thank you. Question for me or Mr. Stiles?
Yes, it's for you.
Yeah, thank you. It's the reality is just as you describe, and these are not challenges to just wave away. These are serious challenges. The homework gap is real, the access gaps are real, and we have to figure out a way forward. And so, you know, in terms of what's happening, what needs to happen on the ground, you know, I've suggested a few ideas in terms of really getting ready for the fall, recognizing that all students are going to be coming in at different grade levels and competency levels, and that grades, in some ways, grade levels will mean almost nothing next year. And I think it should push us to ask whether grade levels ever meant that much. Students were always at different levels. And so I hope that this will be a time when we really take stock and really think about what are the competencies and skills that students need to have in order to progress to the next levels, and how do we get serious about making sure they have them. I think that means that, first of all, we will have to get better at real data about competency-based approaches with kids, like a medical chart with anybody who is entering in a healthcare situation. We probably want to have something like an intake evaluation for every student to really assess their competencies, really understand what kinds of social emotional challenges they've been facing, and start orienting skill building around those competencies. In my view, that's something that parents should also have access to, because they're going to continue to be co-creators of their child's education next year, as they always should be. And so let's arm folks with that information, really rich, meaningful, intensive information. And then let's be really clear about what kinds of strategies are going to be delivered to that student on an individual basis to make sure that she's prepared to go as fast as she can, as far as she can, a limitless, boundless education. It's hard. We're used to thinking about grade levels. It's going to push us. And I think that's okay. I think that's healthy. And ultimately, it's going to make all of us, all of our kids, better off.
Yeah, Mr. Stiles, I was going to ask you about how we can better position our parents to support their children.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely something that weighs on our mind right now. We've surveyed over almost 1,100 families so far in our community survey. What we are finding in our real-time survey data from parents and guardians, aunts, uncles, grandparents who are the lead educators right now, they are struggling, right? When I talked about proportions, I wasn't joking. I had a grandma tell me the other day, I have no clue how to teach my kid how to learn proportions. So I think what our families are asking for and what I'm hearing, I mean, even feedback from our teachers, and we've met with all 10 of our staff. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Is our adults are asking for training, right? They've never been exposed to Google Classroom. They've never been exposed to those digital platforms that we were taught in college, like Canvas and Schoology. They don't know they're not familiar with the educational platforms. So I think one thing that we need to rally the troops with nationally is to come up with a game plan and a platform and some designated time and some funds to teach adults how to A, use technology, B, how to operate the technology, navigate the educational sites, but more importantly, spend time partnering with our community to teach them how to teach kids. They are not certified educators. You can't replace the teacher in the classroom, but we do need to have our staff across the country help teach them. But the sole piece there is access and making sure that homework gap is being addressed. So I hope that we find a way to centralize our efforts in districts, to centralize where activities, assignments, and lessons are being posted to make it easier for families. Again, that's money, right? So you have to create a platform where people can find information. I hope we also make it a priority to have tutorials for families so they understand how to teach, but also how to use the platforms as well. It's a partnership. And we got to take time.
Thank you very much. I'm sure I'm out of time, Mr. Chair. I yield back. Thank you. Thank you both.
Mr. Scott, if I may interject, Ms. Wilson is in the lobby. She's been waiting to get on.
Is she on now?
She should be.
Ms. Wilson? Well, we'll come back to it. Mr. Scano.
Congresswoman Wilson.
Mr. Scott.
Okay, Ms. Wilson, we'll be with you next. Mark.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Scott, for organizing this virtual hearing, virtual briefing, providing members of this committee with the opportunity to speak with experts on remote learning. The COVID-19 global pandemic has caused a tremendous amount of uncertainty over the future of education in this country. As schools opened their doors in March to help slow the spread, our students were forced to transition to remote learning. As a former public school teacher in a Title I school, I'm completely understanding the difficulties that many teachers are facing during this pandemic. Lower income schools are already lacking the proper resources needed to ensure that their students were learning at the same rate as their counterparts. About 14% of all public school students receive special education services. And many schools and teachers are holding virtual therapy sessions and working with parents to try to continue with IEPs. Unfortunately, we know that students with disabilities have faced some of the largest disruptions to their education. My first question is to Mr. Stiles. How can schools ensure that students with disabilities do not have long-lasting and negative impacts when schools reopen? And how should Congress their efforts?
Thank you for the question. Cut out a little bit. I think the question was about students with disabilities. Is that the tail end of it?
How can schools ensure that students with disabilities do not have long-lasting and negative impacts when schools reopen? And how can Congress support their efforts?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking. The system's already built for compliance, right? And I think this is an opportunity for us to focus on really rethinking the IEP goals for students and how we're showing evidence that those goals are being met. We already have a part of that process where progress reports are having to be provided to the IEP team, parents and guardians included, about progress towards those IEP goals. I think it would be a great move if we are going to focus on closing some of those gaps that students have experienced with students with disabilities because of the COVID shutdown, to really incorporate reporting / monitoring progress of IEP goals with some of the additional supports that we could possibly see coming our way from the federal government through those progress reports, and then directly connecting those to the IEP goals in that legal document.
Well, thank you. Ms. Lake, it's clear from your analysis that the level of instruction being provided to students varies greatly nationwide. Can you please elaborate on your findings regarding the number? Hello?
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Mrs. Lake, can you please elaborate on your findings regarding the number or percentage of districts that are providing actual instruction in the midst of school closures, not just access to resources, but actual instruction? And secondly, I would love to know if there's any data about frequency of the instruction. How long are students online? How long are students in online classes each day? And are students receiving instruction in each course subject or just math and reading? I know our teachers are doing the very best that they can do with what they have, but I would like to get maybe the answers to those questions.
Absolutely, thank you. Happy to share a little bit. We also have a number of resources on crpe.org available. The majority of districts are providing some access to instruction, but it tends to be one-way instruction. And so a recorded video or worksheets that are sent home, that kind of thing. There are very few what we call, real-time synchronous kind of instruction activities going on. And significantly less time than a typical school day. And let me give you just a little bit of specifics there. So about 2/3 of districts that we track are providing access to some kind of instruction. And of those, most of those are the pre-recorded or one-way. The instructional expectations in terms of learning time are averaging, as far as we can tell, and this is imperfect information because we're going from what districts are providing publicly, averaging about 3 to 4 hours per day when there is real instruction required. And in some cases, elementary students in particular are getting significantly less, and you can imagine all the reasons why. It's a much different dynamic than high school students, and that's sometimes looking like 30 to 60 minutes a day. And all of those kind of time estimates are including expectations about students working independently, sometimes doing assignments as well as actual instruction. So the access to instruction, especially for younger students, is pretty small at this point, and pretty limited.
Well, I thank you for those responses. Are you still? Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, and we've got a number of people who want to ask questions. I appreciate your thank you. I appreciate your questions, and we'll go now to Ms. Wilson from Florida. Frederica? Is she muted, Frederica Wilson? Okay, well, Ms. Bonamici, Mr. Norcross, Ms. Jayapal, Mr. Morelli, Ms. Wild, Mr. Harder, Ms. McBath, Dr. Schreier, Ms. Underwood, Ms. Hayes, Dr. Shalala, and 11.
Bingo. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. You know, the speaker called the last minute meeting with the freshmen, so that's where some of those folks may be. But I'm really grateful to you for calling this this forum together, and to our outstanding presenters. I've been really listening to all this with great interest. Let me ask you two things, really. One is, you know, a crisis like this often, well, everything's going to change, and it calls to our attention to something that we failed at forever, which is fully funding IDEA. And what would it do when I talk to my superintendents, my teachers union, my state superintendent? I mean, if we really fully funded IDEA, it would be, you know, transformative in this moment in dealing with some of the issues that both of you have spoken about. So that's one thing. And the second thing also relates to the question of crisis management versus dealing with deeper problems. In Michigan, there about 40% of students, maybe close to 600,000 children, lack access to remote learning for one of the several reasons, right? Lack of internet access, lack of devices, lack of support. And as you know, sometimes when there's a device in the home, mom or dad is using it to work remotely anyway, so they really don't have it. And I know there's been some short-term like fixes about hotspots and so forth, but as I'm working with Chairman Scott on the need to stand up a contact tracing army to deal with this, and I'm pretty sure we're going to be having to have some kind of remote learning on an ongoing basis because of the spacing necessary, even if we in the fall. So if you want to talk about IDEA, and secondly, if you want to talk about what a more durable solution to this might look like, rather than throwing Band-Aids at it, because I think we're going to be dealing with this coronavirus, at least in, you know, different places in the country for, you know, quite some time.
I'll share a few comments really fast, just in case our second presenter wants to jump in as well. I'll jump right to what teachers do best, and that's teach. So just to give you a little confidence, these are my beliefs about educators in this country. If we give them the tools and the resources, and we provide the students with the tools and the resources, our teachers in this country and our staff in the country will always deliver. So if you're asking what those solutions are for those deeper problems, whether remote learning is happening and schools are in session, or if schools are shut down and we're engaging in remote learning again, every student needs a device. They need a laptop, and I'm talking K-12, a laptop, an iPad, a tablet, so they have the chance. And they also need reliable internet access, whether that's hotspots or whether that's residential Wi-Fi in the home. Those are desperately needed. If you ask me what I believe that the top priorities are, those two things. If we address that divide right there and eliminate that gap, teachers and those role models will deliver during any type of remote learning. We've had time to figure this out. We've had time to respond and start increasing our skill sets. And our staff is doing a dynamite job right now. We've got the whole summer to start preparing for any type of potential shutdown or additional remote learning. So I place a top priority on addressing that homework gap that exists right now.
Thank you, Dr. Lake.
I will just add quickly on IDEA. Yes, fully fund, and in the process, let's also move to not just a focus on compliance with rules, but also a real commitment to addressing the outcomes for kids with disabilities. We're going to have to grapple with where they are and where they need to be and get serious about addressing them. In terms of long-term getting beyond the crisis management here, yes, I think it's not just next year, but we're going to be dealing with the after effects of this, at least educationally, and certainly economically for many, many years. So we're going to have a lot to grapple with. I would say that for me, what gives me the most hope is what I'm hearing from students and educators who have said, a light bulb has gone off for them in this time where they have realized that some students just love having more flexibility about when they turn in their work, when they do their work, flexibility and ownership over their education. And they don't want to go back to a command and control environment that they experienced previously. Other students hate this and can't wait to get back into a traditional classroom where they just thrive and love it. Some students with disabilities excel. Others are really struggling. And so grappling with those kind of light bulb moments that went off for students and educators and saying, how can we take the best of that and harness it and really train up our next generation of teaching corps to be able to deliver on the good stuff, while also understanding that the relationships in the classroom and the presence are magical things that we probably appreciate more than ever. So I think we're going to be balancing these tensions and trade-offs, and sometimes they will come in conflict, and it's going to require leadership for us to work through them to do what's right for kids.
Just
Oh, go ahead.
Just one piece I'd also like to stress, just the idea that a priority I would share as well is just state fiscal stabilization. $300 million in cuts just this fiscal year in Ohio, with more to come. So knowing reductions are going to happen in districts just in Ohio and probably across the country. State fiscal stabilization would be something I would stress, and I share those in my recommendations. But also any type of support the districts get. Now, I'm not asking for free reign, so please don't take me as that, but just some flexibility for districts to leverage funds, additional funds, to meet the unique needs of their districts. We heard some of the different districts and the setups earlier in the comments, but just flexibility would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We're just about out of time. So Ms. Omar, Ms. Trone, Ms. Stevens, Ms. Lee, Ms. Trahan. Laura, you there? You're muted. Okay. Mr. Castro, is anyone there that I missed?
If you're calling from a phone line, please use *6 to unmute yourself.
Did I miss anyone?
No, sir.
Okay. I thought I saw Lori listed on the participants. I had a couple of questions, but I see we're out of time. But I want to express my appreciation for your being here. You focused our attention on the needs of students, the equity gaps, the need for summer programs, special education, achievement gaps, the things we need to focus on, but particularly the gaps in access to equitable access to the internet. It's not there now, and it's certainly something we can afford to fix. If we don't fix it, we'll be relegating these students to a second-class education, so long as a substantial portion of it is by distance learning. So Dr. Stiles and Ms. Lake, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate your participation, and we may be calling on you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. This ends the meeting.